Ted Cruz thought he could embarrass freshman Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett during a heated Senate Judiciary hearing. What happened next left the Texas senator completely speechless and created one of the most viral political moments of 2025. But the two cameras were rolling live on C-SPAN when Cruz, with his signature smirk, launched what he believed would be a devastating attack on the young Texas Democrat. But Crockett had been waiting for this moment her entire career. What she pulled out next didn't just silence Cruz. It destroyed him so completely that within minutes, Cruz Meltdown was trending worldwide. Before we dive into this incredible political takedown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. You won't want to miss how this freshman congresswoman just changed the entire political game in Texas. The moment this confrontation started, you could feel the electricity in the air. Political insiders knew something big was about to happen. Cruz had been targeting Crockett for weeks, making snide comments about inexperienced Democrats in interviews and social media posts. He'd been setting up this moment, planning to use a high-profile hearing to establish his dominance over the new generation of Democratic politicians. But what Cruz didn't know was that Crockett had been studying him just as carefully. She'd watched every one of his committee performances, analyzed his debate tactics, and identified his biggest weakness, his ego. Cruz's need to be seen as the smartest person in the room made him predictable, and Crockett was about to use that predictability to destroy him. The Senate Judiciary hearing room was packed with reporters, cameras, and tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Major news networks had sent their top political correspondents, sensing that this hearing might produce fireworks. Social media was already buzzing with anticipation, as political Twitter had been speculating about a potential Cruz-Crockett showdown for days. Cruz sat there adjusting his tie, that familiar, confident grin spreading across his face as he prepared to do what he does best, destroy his opponents with what he calls constitutional facts and logic. His staff had prepared a thick folder of talking points, constitutional citations, and what they believed were devastating attacks on Crockett's record. But across the room, Jasmine Crockett sat calm and collected, her hands folded, eyes sharp as a laser. She knew this moment was coming, and she was ready. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two political figures are and why this battle was inevitable. Ted Cruz, the 54-year-old Harvard Law graduate, has been Texas's controversial senator since 2013. Known for his aggressive debate style and constitutional arguments, Cruz built his reputation by taking down opponents with prepared talking points and legal technicalities. He's the guy who famously filibustered for 21 hours, who challenged Trump in 2016, and who never backs down from a fight. Cruz sees himself as the constitutional scholar in the room, the guy who can out-debate anyone with pure intellectual firepower. But here's what makes Cruz dangerous. He's calculated. Every attack is planned, every word chosen for maximum damage. He studies his opponents, finds their weak spots, and then strikes with surgical precision. Cruz had been watching Crockett since she arrived in Congress, waiting for the perfect moment to establish dominance over what he saw as an inexperienced freshman who got lucky in a Democratic district. On the other side sits Jasmine Crockett, the 43-year-old civil rights attorney turned congresswoman who represents Texas's 30th district. But don't let the freshman label fool you. Crockett spent years as a criminal defense lawyer, handling cases where she had to think fast, fight hard, and never show weakness. She's not just some politician who got elected on promises. She's a woman who's been in courtrooms facing hostile judges, aggressive prosecutors, and impossible odds her entire career. Crockett grew up in St. Louis, worked her way through law school, and built her reputation defending people the system wanted to forget. When she moved to Texas and entered politics, she brought that same fight-or-die mentality with her. She's not intimidated by titles, degrees, or reputations. In fact, she feeds off confrontation. But what makes this confrontation so important is what it represents. This isn't just two politicians arguing. This is the old guard versus the new generation, establishment versus insurgent, calculated politics versus raw authenticity. Cruz represents everything people hate about Washington: the smug superiority, the constitutional lecturing, the belief that Harvard credentials make you untouchable. Crockett represents the opposite: real experience, street smarts, and the willingness to call out hypocrisy no matter who's in the room. She's part of a new generation of politicians who refuse to play by the old rules of respectful disagreement and polite destruction. The stakes couldn't be higher. Cruz was using this hearing to position himself for another presidential run, showing conservative donors that he could still dominate debates and destroy Democratic opponents. For Crockett, this was her chance to prove that the new generation of politicians wouldn't be intimidated by the old boys club. The hearing was supposed to be about voting rights legislation, but everyone in that room knew it was really about power, respect, and who would control the narrative in modern American politics. Cruz came prepared to make Crockett look inexperienced and out of her depth. Crockett came prepared to show the country that the emperor had no clothes. What made this confrontation even more intense was the personal history between Texas politicians. Cruz had been dismissive of rising Democratic stars in Texas for years, particularly women of color who challenged his authority. He'd made comments about identity politics and inexperienced activists that everyone knew were aimed at politicians, like Crockett. This wasn't just political disagreement. This was personal. The national political context made this moment even more significant. With the 2024 elections approaching, both parties were looking for moments that could energize their base and demonstrate their ability to fight. Cruz needed to show Republican donors that he was still the constitutional warrior they'd supported in 2016. Crockett needed to prove that the new generation of Democrats wouldn't be intimidated by old-school political bullies. The voting rights issue itself was explosive enough, but adding the personal and political dynamics between these two Texas politicians created a perfect storm of confrontation that political observers knew could define both of their careers. The tension had been building all morning during the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on voting rights. Cruz had been relatively quiet during the first 2 hours, taking notes, whispering to his staff, and occasionally nodding with that condescending smile that signals he's about to pounce. The committee was discussing the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act when Crockett began presenting evidence of voter suppression in Texas counties. She was methodical, citing specific cases where polling locations had been closed in predominantly Black and Latino communities, where voter registration drives had been criminally prosecuted, and where election officials had been purged for refusing to implement discriminatory policies. The evidence is clear, Crockett said, holding up a thick folder of documents. Texas has systematically targeted communities of color with surgical precision to reduce their voting power. This isn't speculation. It's documented fact. That's when Cruz leaned forward, his eyes lighting up like a predator spotting wounded prey. He'd been waiting for this exact moment. Mr. Chairman, if I may interrupt the gentle lady from Texas, Cruz said, his voice dripping with fake politeness. I think it's important that we have accurate information before this committee, and I'm concerned that the freshman congresswoman may not fully understand the complexities of Texas election law. The room went dead silent. Every reporter's pen stopped moving. Every camera zoomed in. Cruz had just called Crockett a freshman, the ultimate dismissal in Washington politics, and suggested she didn't understand her own state's laws. Crockett's response was ice-cold calm. I'm sorry, Senator Cruz. Did you just suggest that I don't understand Texas law, the same Texas law I've been practicing for over 15 years? But Cruz was just getting started. He stood up, adjusting his jacket with theatrical flair, and launched into what he clearly thought would be a devastating attack. Well, Congresswoman, with all due respect to your limited experience in federal constitutional law, I think it's important that this committee understand the actual legal framework we're operating under. Cruz's voice got louder, more confident. I've argued 9 cases before the Supreme Court. I've been studying constitutional law since before you were even practicing law. And what I see here is a fundamental misunderstanding of the Voting Rights Act, the Constitution, and basic legal precedent. The conservative members of the committee started nodding approvingly. Cruz was in his element now, pacing slightly, gesturing with his hands like he was giving a lecture to law students. The cases you're citing, Congresswoman, have been repeatedly rejected by federal courts. The precedents you're relying on have been overturned. And frankly, your interpretation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act shows a concerning lack of understanding of how constitutional analysis actually works in practice. Cruz paused for effect, clearly believing he had just delivered a knockout punch. The smirk was back, bigger than ever. He'd just publicly humiliated a freshman congresswoman on live television, questioned her legal competence, and positioned himself as the constitutional expert in the room. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of looking flustered or defensive, Crockett smiled. Not a nervous smile or a fake political smile, a genuine, confident smile that said, "Thank you for walking right into my trap." "Senator Cruz," she said, her voice steady and clear, "before you continue lecturing me about constitutional law, I think this committee and the American people deserve to know about your own track record with legal accuracy." Cruz's expression shifted slightly. Something in her tone suggested this wasn't going where he expected. "I've been sitting here listening to you talk about Supreme Court arguments and constitutional expertise, and I have to ask, are you talking about the same Ted Cruz who argued that the 2020 election should be overturned based on claims that every court in America, including judges appointed by Republican presidents, found to be completely without merit?" The room tension ratcheted up another level. Cruz's staff started shuffling papers nervously. "Are we talking about the same constitutional expert who stood on the Senate floor on January 6th and voted to reject electoral votes based on conspiracy, theories that had been debunked by your own Texas Secretary of State?" Cruz tried to interrupt, but Crockett was just getting warmed up. "Because if we're going to talk about misunderstanding constitutional law, maybe we should discuss how you've spent the last 4 years undermining the very democratic institutions you claim to defend." The conservative committee members looked uncomfortable. This wasn't how these hearings usually went. Typically, when Cruz launched one of his constitutional lectures, Democratic witnesses either got defensive or tried to match his legal jargon. They didn't flip the script and put him on trial. Cruz's face was starting to redden. His carefully planned attack was falling apart, and worse, he was being forced to defend himself instead of prosecuting his target. "Congresswoman, that's a complete mischaracterization of my position. And frankly, it's beneath the dignity of this committee to—" "Oh, we're talking about dignity now," Crockett cut him off smoothly. "That's interesting, coming from someone who fled to Cancun while Texans were freezing to death during the power grid failure." Gasps echoed through the hearing room. Several reporters started typing frantically. Crockett had just brought up the most embarrassing moment of Cruz's political career, when he was caught flying to a luxury resort in Mexico while his constituents were literally dying in the cold. But she wasn't done. Crockett reached into her folder and pulled out a document that Cruz couldn't see from his position. "Since you want to question my understanding of Texas law, Senator, maybe you can help this committee understand something. I have here the legal brief you filed in the case of Texas versus Pennsylvania, where you argued that other states' elections were invalid and should be thrown out." Cruz's eyes went wide. He knew exactly what document she was holding, and he knew what was coming next. This brief was so legally frivolous that it was rejected without comment by the Supreme Court. Not argued and lost, rejected as so obviously baseless that the court wouldn't even waste time hearing it. And yet you signed your name to it and used your Harvard law degree to legitimize what every serious legal scholar called a constitutional coup attempt. The hearing room was now completely silent, except for the clicking of camera shutters. Cruz looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. His planned attack on Crockett's credentials had just backfired spectacularly, and now she was methodically destroying his reputation as a serious constitutional lawyer. "So before you lecture me about constitutional law, Senator, maybe you should explain to this committee and to the people of Texas why they should trust the legal judgment of someone who spent 4 years trying to overthrow democracy and then ran away to Mexico when his constituents needed him most. Cruz was visibly shaking now, his hands gripping the edge of the table. This was supposed to be his moment of dominance, his chance to show Democratic witnesses that he was still the king of constitutional debate. Instead, he was being systematically dismantled by a freshman congresswoman who had turned his own reputation against him. The other Republican committee members looked increasingly uncomfortable as they watched their colleague being destroyed on live television. Several started checking their phones, probably hoping their own past statements wouldn't be subjected to the same level of scrutiny. Democratic committee members, meanwhile, were struggling to hide their amazement and delight at watching Cruz finally meet his match. Behind Cruz, his staff was frantically taking notes and whispering among themselves, clearly trying to figure out how to salvage this disaster. One aide was seen desperately scrolling through her phone, possibly looking for talking points or damage control strategies, but there was no coming back from this level of public humiliation. The C-SPAN cameras captured every moment of Cruz's visible distress, the reddening face, the nervous fidgeting, the complete loss of his usual arrogant composure. Social media. Users watching the live stream were already creating memes and reaction GIFs from his expressions of shock and anger. The chairman tried to restore order, but the damage was done. Cruz had walked into a buzzsaw, and everyone in that room knew it. The man who built his career on intellectual superiority had just been outmaneuvered by someone he'd tried to dismiss as inexperienced, and the entire country was watching it happen in real time. What happened next will go down in political history as one of the most complete destructions ever captured on live television. Cruz, his face now completely red and his voice shaking with barely controlled rage, made the fatal mistake of trying to fight back instead of cutting his losses. "Congresswoman, your characterization of my legal record is not only false, it's defamatory," he sputtered, pointing his finger across the room. "I have spent my entire career defending constitutional principles, and I will not sit here and allow a freshman member of Congress to impugn my integrity based on partisan talking points." The moment those words left his mouth, you could see, in Crockett's eyes, that Cruz had just made the biggest mistake of his political career. He had given her the perfect opening, and she was about to drive a truck through it. Partisan talking points? Crockett's voice rose slightly, but it was controlled anger, the kind that comes from years of courtroom experience. "Senator, these aren't talking points. These are facts. And since you want to talk about integrity, let's talk about integrity." She stood up, holding the legal brief in one hand and reaching for another document with the other. The entire hearing room leaned forward. "You filed this brief in December 2020, arguing that Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, and Wisconsin had conducted invalid elections and that their electoral votes should be thrown out. You signed your name to a document that legal scholars across the political spectrum called a constitutional abomination. You used your position as a United States Senator to legitimize the big lie." Cruz tried to interrupt again, but Crockett's voice cut through the room like a sword. "And then, Senator, on January 6, 2021, while a mob was attacking the Capitol building, while police officers were being beaten with flagpoles, while democracy itself was under assault, you stood on the Senate floor and voted to reject the electoral votes from Arizona." She paused, letting that sink in before delivering the knockout punch. "So, when you talk about constitutional principles and integrity, I have to ask, which constitutional principles were you defending when you tried to overturn a free and fair election? Which integrity were you showing when you helped incite an insurrection and then hid in a secure location while Capitol police officers died defending our democracy?" The hearing room exploded. Conservative committee members started talking over each other, trying to object and restore order. Liberal members sat in stunned silence, watching a freshman congresswoman do what Senate Democrats had been afraid to do for years. Reporters were frantically taking notes and sending updates to their newsrooms. But Cruz, instead of backing down or trying to deflect, made an even bigger mistake. He completely lost his composure. "How dare you?" he shouted. standing up so abruptly that his chair rolled backward. "How dare you sit there and lecture me about January 6th? I condemned the violence. I never supported violence. And for you to suggest otherwise is a disgraceful lie." His voice was cracking, his hands were shaking, and his famous Harvard-trained composure was completely gone. This was Ted Cruz having a complete meltdown on live television, and Crockett wasn't even close to finished. "You condemned the violence, Senator? Really?" Her voice was deadly calm now, the voice of a prosecutor who knows she has the defendant exactly where she wants him. "Because I have your tweets from that day right here." She held up her phone, and the C-SPAN cameras zoomed in to capture the moment. At 2:38 p.m. on January 6th, while the Capitol was under attack, you tweeted, and I quote, "The objection I'm raising today has precedent. You were still defending your vote to reject electoral votes, while people were literally breaking down the doors of the Senate chamber." Cruz's face went from red to purple. His staff was frantically trying to get his attention, obviously wanting him to stop talking, but Cruz was too far gone to listen. "That's taken completely out of context," he screamed. "You're twisting my words. You're lying about my record." And that's when Crockett delivered the final blow. "Senator, I'm not twisting anything. I'm a lawyer, just like you claim to be. I know how to read legal documents and tweets and voting records. And what I see is a man who spent 4 years undermining democracy, who helped incite an insurrection, who fled the country when his constituents were dying, and who is now having a complete meltdown because a freshman congresswoman is holding him accountable for his actions." She paused, looked directly into the C-SPAN camera, and spoke directly to the American people. This is what accountability looks like. This is what happens when someone who has spent decades hiding behind credentials and privilege finally gets called out by someone who isn't afraid of his reputation or his Harvard degree or his Supreme Court arguments. Then she turned back to Cruz, who was still standing, still shaking, still looking like a man whose entire world had just collapsed. "Senator, you came into this hearing thinking you could intimidate me because I'm new, because I'm a woman, because I'm black, because you thought your resume would scare me into silence. But what you didn't count on is that I've been dealing with bullies like you my entire career. I've been in courtrooms with prosecutors and judges who thought they could intimidate me with their titles and their credentials. And you know what I learned?" Cruz was staring at her now, completely speechless for the first time in his political career. "I learned that credentials without character are meaningless. I learned that degrees without integrity are worthless. And I learned that the loudest voices in the room are usually the most insecure." The hearing room was dead silent, except for the sound of camera shutters clicking. Cruz stood there, mouth slightly open, looking like a man who had just been hit by a freight train he never saw coming. "So here's what's going to happen, Senator. You're going to sit down, you're going to stop interrupting witnesses, and you're going to let the adults in this room have a conversation about voting rights. Because clearly, you're not qualified to lead this discussion." Cruz finally sat down, but his humiliation wasn't over. Committee Chairman Dick Durbin, clearly struggling to contain his own amazement at what he'd just witnessed, called for a brief recess. But as the committee members started to leave their seats, Cruz made one final, desperate attempt to salvage his dignity. "This is exactly what's wrong with politics today," he muttered into his microphone, apparently forgetting it was still on. "No respect for experience, no respect for credentials, just personal attacks and—" "Senator," Crockett's voice cut through the room one last time. "The only personal attack here was when you suggested I wasn't qualified to understand Texas law. Everything else I said was about your public record. If you can't handle someone discussing your actual votes and actions, maybe you shouldn't be in public service." Cruz said nothing. For the first time in his political career, Ted Cruz had been rendered completely speechless. He gathered his papers, avoided eye contact with everyone in the room, and walked out during what was supposed to be a brief recess. He never came back. The moment Ted Cruz walked out of that hearing room, American politics changed forever. Within minutes, clips of Crockett's destruction of Cruz were spreading across social media like wildfire, and the political establishment was scrambling to understand what they'd just witnessed. The first indication of how seismic this moment came from the C-SPAN livestream comments, which exploded in real time as viewers watched Cruz's complete meltdown. Comments like, "Holy shit, did that just happen?" and "Cruz just got destroyed" started flooding in before the committee even called its recess. But the real explosion came when the first Twitter clip hit the platform at 3:47 p.m. Eastern Time. A Democratic staffer had already cut the key moment. Crockett's "credentials without character are meaningless" line paired with Cruz's silent, stunned reaction, and posted it with the caption, "Freshman Congresswoman Jasmine ended Ted Cruz's career in 30 seconds. The tweet got 10,000 retweets in the first hour. By 5 p.m., Cruz meltdown was trending nationwide, with over 100,000 tweets. By 6 p.m., it was trending worldwide. The hashtag, "credentials without character," started trending separately, with people using it to call out politicians, bosses, and authority figures who hide behind titles instead of showing actual leadership. The most viral moment came when someone posted a side-by-side video. Cruz's confident, "I've argued 9 cases before the Supreme Court" statement from the beginning of the hearing, followed immediately by his red-faced voice cracking, "How dare you?" Meltdown. The contrast was so stark, so visually devastating, that it became an instant meme template. Conservative Twitter tried to defend Cruz, but their efforts only made things worse. When they posted, "Ted Cruz was unfairly attacked by radical Democrat," the replies were brutal. Progressive users flooded the comments with clips of Cruz's Texas versus Pennsylvania brief, his January 6th vote, and photos of him at the Cancun airport during the Texas freeze. One particularly savage reply that got 50,000 likes simply said, "Ted Cruz was attacked by facts. Apparently he's allergic." The media response was unlike anything political reporters had seen in years. CNN's Anderson Cooper opened his show that night by saying, "I've covered politics for decades, and I have never seen a more complete political destruction than what Jasmine Crockett did to Ted Cruz today." He then played the entire exchange without commentary, letting viewers watch Cruz's humiliation unfold in real time. MSNBC's Rachel Maddow dedicated her entire opening segment to what she called the death of Ted Cruz's political persona. She methodically went through each of Crockett's points, showing how every accusation was backed up by documented evidence and contrasting it with Cruz's emotional, fact-free response. "This wasn't just a political argument," Maddow said. "This was a masterclass in how to hold power accountable. Crockett didn't just win this exchange, she taught every other politician watching how to deal with bullies who hide behind credentials." Even Fox News couldn't defend Cruz effectively. While they tried to frame it as a heated exchange between 2 Texas politicians, their own viewers were commenting that Cruz looked weak and unprepared. Tucker Carlson, usually a reliable Cruz defender, didn't mention the incident at all on his show, a silence that spoke volumes. The late-night comedy shows had a field day. Stephen Colbert opened his monologue by saying, "Ted Cruz got so thoroughly destroyed today that NASA is studying the debris field." Jimmy Kimmel showed the clip of Cruz walking out and added his own commentary. "That's the same walk Ted Cruz used when he left for Cancun, except this time he was running from accountability instead of responsibility." But the real measure of how devastating this moment was came from Cruz's own response, or rather, his complete lack of one. For the first time in his political career, Ted Cruz went completely silent on social media. The man who normally tweets 10-15 times a day, who responds to every criticism with lengthy constitutional lectures, who never misses a chance to defend himself, posted nothing. His Twitter account went dark for 48 hours. When he finally resurfaced, it was with a weak statement about partisan attacks and lowering the discourse. But even his most loyal supporters could see that something fundamental had changed. The confidence was gone. The swagger was missing. Ted Cruz, the man who built his reputation on never backing down from a fight, had been so thoroughly beaten that he couldn't even bring himself to fight back. Behind the scenes, Republican operatives were in full panic mode, Cruz had been positioning himself for another presidential run in 2028, and this moment had potentially derailed those plans before they even began. A senior GOP strategist, speaking anonymously to Politico, said, "Ted's brand was being the smartest guy in the room, the constitutional expert who could out-debate anyone. Jasmine Crockett just shattered that brand on live television. I don't know how he comes back from this." The impact on Crockett was the opposite, immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Her congressional office was flooded with calls of support from constituents across Texas and donations from across the country. Democratic fundraising emails featuring clips of her Cruz takedown raised over $2 million in the first 72 hours. More importantly, Crockett had established herself as a national political figure overnight. Cable news shows were booking her for interviews, progressive organizations were asking her to headline fundraisers, and political observers were already talking about her as a potential Senate candidate or even future presidential material. What Jasmine Crockett did today wasn't just good politics, said Democratic strategist James Carville. It was necessary politics. For too long, Democrats have been afraid to call out Republican hypocrisy directly. Crockett showed that when you have the facts on your side and the courage to use them, you can expose these bullies for what they really are. The broader political implications were enormous. For years, Ted Cruz had intimidated Democratic witnesses in committee hearings with his aggressive questioning style and constitutional lectures. Other Republican senators had copied his approach, using their credentials and seniority to browbeat younger, less experienced Democrats. Crockett's destruction of Cruz sent a message to every politician in Washington. Credentials don't make you untouchable, and if you try to bully someone who's prepared, you might end up embarrassing yourself on national television. The voting rights hearing, which was supposed to be Cruz's opportunity to score political points against Democratic witnesses, became a disaster for Republicans. The other GOP committee members, having watched Cruz get destroyed, were noticeably more subdued in their questioning. Several Democratic witnesses explicitly referenced Crockett's exchange with Cruz, using it as evidence that Republican opposition to voting rights was based on politics rather than constitutional principles. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was what this moment revealed about the changing dynamics of American politics. For decades, political power in Washington has been based on seniority, credentials, and institutional knowledge. The old guard, people like Cruz, Mitch McConnell, and Chuck Grassley, have maintained their influence by intimidating newer members and controlling the narrative through parliamentary procedure and constitutional expertise. Crockett's takedown of Cruz showed that this old dynamic is breaking down. In an age of social media and instant fact-checking, credentials without substance can be exposed immediately. A freshman congresswoman with a smartphone and a law degree can fact-check a Harvard-educated senator in real time and destroy his reputation in front of millions of viewers. The generational implications were equally important. Cruz represents the old model of political authority, impressive resume, Ivy League credentials, constitutional expertise used as a weapon to silence opposition. Crockett represents something new, practical experience, authentic communication, and the willingness to challenge authority regardless of titles or reputation. This wasn't just a political argument. It was a changing of the guard, broadcast live on C-SPAN for the entire country to see. In the weeks following the hearing, political scientists and commentators began referring to the exchange as the Crockett moment, a turning point where the old rules of political deference and credential-based authority began to break down. As one Harvard political science professor put it, what we witnessed wasn't just Jasmine Crockett destroying Ted Cruz. We witnessed a new generation of politicians refusing to be intimidated by the old boys club. And if Cruz, one of the most skilled debaters in the Senate, can be so thoroughly embarrassed by a freshman congresswoman, then no politician is safe from accountability anymore. The question now isn't whether other politicians will try to replicate Crockett's approach. It's whether they'll be skilled enough to pull it off. Because as Ted Cruz learned the hard way, in the new era of American politics, your reputation is only as strong as your last performance, and no amount of credentials can save you from a politician who's prepared, fearless, and armed with the truth. The era of Ted Cruz intimidating witnesses with constitutional lectures is over. The era of Jasmine Crockett holding power accountable has just begun. And for anyone wondering what's next, Crockett has already announced that she's planning to ask Cruz some very specific questions about his role in January 6th during the next judiciary hearing. Something tells us Ted Cruz might find a reason to be absent that day. What did you think of Jasmine Crockett's complete destruction of Ted Cruz? Drop a comment below and let us know if you think this changes everything for both of their political careers. And if you want to see more moments like this where accountability meets power, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next political earthquake. Because in today's political climate, you never know when the next establishment figure is going to get completely exposed on live television.